So the case that I've been asked to tell you now, and I'm biting on my tongue because I want to tell you other stories, but the case that Tenny and Ralph asked me to tell you is a story of Idaho, and it's an Appreciative Inquiry Summit. I got a phone call or an email from a woman in the state of Idaho who said, we need to have an Appreciative Inquiry Summit. And I said to her, first of all, I said, who are you? But then I said, why do you need to have a summit? She said, well, we are the State Department of Education. We provide educational services for the students throughout the state, and particularly for students who are deaf and blind. We have a very well-known school for students who are deaf and blind. And something happened a few years ago that has caused us to have a big problem. So one of our state legislators, so this is a person in leadership in the state government, was overheard saying, you know, we ought to close that school. We could provide the services in a much cheaper way. Because he was a person of authority, that quote got caught and was published in the newspaper. They're calling me, and it's 3 years later. They have not been able to stop the rumor. There was no intention to close the school. There was a huge rumor. Parents who had moved from other states into Idaho so their children could go to that state are saying, should we be leaving? Teachers are saying, should I look for another job? So it was really quite a problem, to use the old language. And the person who called me was in a PhD program, working, and she had learned about Appreciative Inquiry and the Appreciative Inquiry Summit, and she said, the only thing that's going to help us stop this rumor is if we get everybody in the same room at the same time. And I said, who do you mean by everybody? And she listed the stakeholders that they were willing to bring together. Now, it's a school for students who are deaf and blind in a state. Who would you imagine ought to be on that list of invited to attend? Who would you include?
Students, parents, teachers.
Okay, students who are deaf and students who are blind,
Legislators.
parents, teachers,
Legislators.
the legislators,
Other public officials who
other public
administer
officials like the
Board of Ed-
governor's office,
boards of education.
Board of Education. They were the Board of Education who was hosting it.
Maybe other schools that teach deaf and blind.
Other all schools, the universities that teach the people who teach deaf and blind. People from other states who are interested in their program because they're one of the best.
Interpreters? How to say
And yes, sign interpreters. Absolutely. So when they said to me, yes, we mean everybody, all of the agencies, the social service agencies that provide services, those that were on their side and those that were not so favorable, because there was a certain amount of controversy, I said, okay, we'll do this. So let me see what the next slide says here. Okay, we'll come back to, here it is. So we're looking at this, and the first question is, so what's the purpose of this meeting? We're now going to bring about 250 people into the room. Oh, and by the way, because it's a public meeting, it had to be open to the public. So anyone could attend. So we really didn't know how many people were going to be there. We designed the room and the meeting so that at each table of 8, there were 2 sign interpreters. Because as I learned, you can sign for about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, but not much longer than that. And so if an activity was going to be have a discussion for 30 minutes, they needed 2 sign interpreters at that table. Right? There were guide dogs in the room. Right? So, but the first question is, so what's the purpose of the meeting? And you know, I just wouldn't go into a meeting where the purpose is, should we close the school? Right? Should we open the school? That's too small. So when we talk about a strategic focus that is compelling, it has to be big enough so that everyone in the room feels there's a reason for them to be there. And so you'll see that they entitled this Educational Excellence, Collaboration in Action. A summit on educational services for the deaf and blind in Idaho. Now, educational excellence, that's what we want more of. And collaboration in action, absolutely needed collaboration. So the focus of this meeting is educational excellence, collaboration, and action. Down here it says the subtext, should we close the school? I mean, that was there. Everybody knew that had to be talked about. Here are the many people who got invited. Now, in the course of the meeting, which was a 3-day meeting, the first thing that happened is people came in and they were assigned tables. So that every table had what we call a max mix. They had some students, some graduates, some business people, some educators, some political leaders. They had people from all of the different stakeholder groups at the table. And very quickly we got into appreciative interviews. Now, what were some of the topics for the appreciative interviews? What would you have people doing interviews about? Okay. One of the questions was what attracted them to education for students who are deaf and blind. Everybody in that room was there because that was what our purpose was. Something had hooked them at some point, whether they were a legislator or whether they were a teacher. They cared about this. So what was it that attracted them? Tell a story about a time in which you interacted with someone different than yourself. And you learned, and you changed and became a better person. And then there were questions about the specifics of the educational services. The other piece that we had going on is there had been a very in-depth research, a very in-depth study on all of the services in the state, and it was called a summative report, coincidentally. So we had questions about, we had them do inquiry into the report. You all had the report before coming to this meeting. What about the report did you find most meaningful? What about the report do you think we should be acting on? So we made the work that was done up until that time meaningful by having it be part of the discovery. As Ralph said earlier, what is it? What history do you need to do your discovery into? Okay. Now, I will share with you one of the things that happened. It was the end of the interviews, and I said, does anyone want to share anything? And there's a woman who was there, and she raised her hand, at one of the tables, and I said yes. She said, I actually am one of the state legislators. I'm a state congresswoman. She said, and I came to this meeting thinking that the purpose of the meeting was to decide on the school, and I thought the school should be closed. She said, however, I've just interviewed George. And George, as you all know, is a businessman in the community. His business is da-da-da-da. And I didn't know this, but George is married to someone who is a graduate of the school. And George told me the story that the reason he can be married to his wife is because she attended the school. She not only learned reading and writing, but she learned life skills. And she can keep the house for George and their children. I have had my mind changed. That school is a valuable contribution to the community that our state has to offer. Now that was after the interviews. We then went on and did dreams. And as you know, that very often after interviews, we have people draw pictures. So they drew pictures of the positive core, of the educational services provided to students who are deaf and blind. We also had a Braille recorder on every table. So everything that happened and was written and hung on a flip chart was also hung in Braille.
Great.
And then we got into the dream phase, and my clients said, yes, we can do skits. I said, we can do skits. Absolutely. So there were people up on stage with their guide dogs, other people signing, and the skits were done by people who are deaf and blind. I learned so much in this process. And the visions for the services were so bigger than the school, so much more than just the school. They had to do with, how do we get more parental involvement? How do we help people with life skills and get them out and in the world? What do we do to give people opportunities to work and practice working? So what new technology, how do we bring new technology for hearing and for sign? And so we went through the process of dreaming and designing, and we went into this meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to design a set of recommendations that would go to the Board of Education and then on to the state legislature for approval and budgeting. So we knew coming into this 3-day meeting that we were going to discover the best, envision what was possible, and then create a set of recommendations. And that recommendations would be created because each table would come up with 1 or 2, we'd pull them together, and that list of recommendations would go forward. We imagined that the school, something about the school, would be one of the recommendations. 2 really interesting things happened. Came in the morning of the 3rd day, and I noticed that there was some kind of chatter at some of the tables. It wasn't like easy chatter. There was something going on. And a woman came up to me and she said, I have a question before you get going. There's a list of recommendations on all of our tables. Are we supposed to accept those recommendations? And I said, could you give me the list? She brings it up to me. Now, some of you know I am pretty fiery, so I can get, that way. I read this list and I went, oh my God. Oh my God. At which point, I got the microphone and I said, something has come to my attention. There are some people who have done a great deal of work on our behalf last night. It's a small group of people who put together a list of recommendations, and they've put them on every table for us to see. I think that's very generous of them to have done that work and to have these ideas for us all. But what I want to be really clear, this is a democratic process. And each of you at your tables can decide what you want the recommendations to be. You may want to look at what's on your table as a starting point, but there is no requirement that you accept it or reject it. The requirement is that you honor the voice of each person. Because as we have been going around the table and each person has been having a turn to talk, that's how you will make your decision on the recommendations. So one small group, one advocacy group, had decided that they were going to push a set of recommendations. I was really nervous, but everybody calmed down, and the advocacy group knew that they had done their work. I think they felt enough respected that their work could be looked at, but it was not going to be taken incomplete. So there was a dialogue, and the next thing that happened, somebody said, but aren't we going to vote on the school? Oh, vote on the school. Well, that wasn't on my agenda either. So I turned and I looked to my clients who happened to be sitting over here to my side. I said, what do you think? And they said, okay, let's vote on the school. Now, having been through some voting before with David Cooperrider and AI at Verizon, I kind of had a little bit of model in my mind of how it would go. And I said, all right, so now at your tables, you have 20 minutes to talk. And what I want each table to decide is, should the school stay opened or closed? And what other recommendations do you want to put forth? Needless to say, when we took the vote, it was unanimous that the school should stay open. And so they took a vote, 250 people. They all voted. They all together made a decision to continue the school, put together a set of recommendations that went to the Board of Education, who, by the way, was in the room, and they refined them, presented them to the state legislature, got it budgeted, and that became their new way of doing what they do in the state.
Can I ask a quick question? The voting was done by tables, not by individuals?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I got that.
Yes. And it was done by tables. And at that point, that was pretty easy because the tables had been working together for 2 whole days and had a bond, and there was no way I was going to open it to everybody, you know, even though I had just talked about democracy. Uh-oh. But, so, you know, in the course of that 3-day meeting, a group of people who were some of them scared and nervous, some of them very antagonistic. There was one person who actually called an agency in Washington, D.C. and reported that we had cords in the room and that blind people would trip over the cords. Well, the people from Washington called my client and said, look, so-and-so is just complaining again. They knew her, but they also just chuckled when we said, yes, the cords that are in the room are so that the blind people who can use their computers with big fonts can plug in. And it's one location and everybody knows it. So there were people who were out to find us doing something wrong. And we just kind of kept going and accepting them and bringing them in. The process was one of those processes where, you know, those kinds of things come along in your career. You get to work with the whole system. It was clearly the whole system. And they were all there, and they all together made a decision. Now, this is the question I think that Ralph and Tenny want you to think about. Okay? And before you think about that, I want to just say one thing. The principles are really important. Really important. But it's all the principles. So if you find yourself saying, oh, people felt more positive, what have you done about the rest of the principles? You know, if you say, okay, well, we had good inquiry going. So you can't take any one of them and really do a whole appreciative inquiry process. It's important for each of you to have your own, you know, the expression theory in use. When you're creating change, what is it that you're changing? And for me, it's really simple. Who talks to whom about what? You know, and in some ways that comes down to the social constructionist principle, but the about what is the positive principle. It's the poetic principle. And if I can change who talks to whom about what, then I know they're going to be doing something different. I don't know what it is. Because that's the piece. You can't predict the outcome if you're truly engaged in an open, dialogic process. You don't know the outcome because it's going to be created along the way. But what you can know is that you've given people respect, they've had a voice, and they're talking to people that they don't usually talk to about things that they don't usually get to talk about. And that's what makes a difference and why I love it.